I want to welcome you to another installment of Interfaith Intersections. This is a project of Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice, a project inspired by the Children of Abraham project that comes out of Dubuque. As always, I want to thank Rabbi Bonnie Margulis, our executive director, with fellow committee members who put this program together, Mount Zion Baptist Church, where we are tonight, for offering their space, Sierra Neitzel, right? Neitzel.
That's close.
Sorry. For her technological expertise, and of course the panelists, whom I'll be introducing shortly. The goals of Interfaith Intersections build upon Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice's previous program called Sacred Sites. There, groups of people went to different houses of worship, spoke usually with the religious leader of that particular institution, and learned a bit about the site itself and about the tradition. Interfaith Intersections tries to do something different. We want to involve community members in conversations around specific topics from the perspective of members of different religious traditions, so as to get a sense of religions as lived experience rather than as buildings or just as a list of tenets. We have already, in the course of 3 previous productions, heard from someone from the Society of Friends, someone from the Catholic Church, 2 representatives of different branches of Judaism, 2 Muslims, 2 Baha'is, and a practitioner of nature spirituality. Tonight's panel will feature representatives from the perspectives of Buddhism, an unaffiliated Jew, and of Baptist Christianity. And tonight's topic is, well, perhaps a somber one. What, from each panelist's perspective, does your tradition teach about death and the afterlife? Put another way, how does your tradition prepare you for what may come after death? Just looking ahead for a moment to our spring sessions, they haven't been announced yet. The planning committee is in process of determining the topics, which may well come from suggestions that people have already made, and you do have evaluation forms here. People online, if you want to suggest a topic, please put it in the chat. For people here, if you have suggestions for future topics, please do indicate it on your evaluation forms. We are in the process of searching for new venues, and we'll release the topics, the dates, and the locations as soon as we can. Notices will be sent out. Please check the Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice Facebook page or our web page to see, and notices will be sent out to you as well. Let me review the format of tonight's presentation. First, we'll have presentations from our 3 panelists, one of whom will be coming in online. That'll take about 30 minutes total. Then we'll have a first round of Q&A, people from the audience, and if you have a question online, please put it in the chat and Sierra will let you know about it. Following that, we'll have breakout sessions where people who are here will gather in groups, and I'm going to split you up, but more on that later. And Sierra will take care of the people online to see if we have maybe 1 or 2 online chat rooms. What you'll do is form small groups among yourselves. We want to encourage a free-flowing discussion, stimulated by what the presenters have had to say, but drawing on your own experiences as well. And there will be no designated moderator in each of those groups. Then we'll convene together for a final wrap-up. where you'll just hear some final thoughts. That's when you'll be able to sign or at least fill out the evaluations. And if you're interested in being a panelist in the future, there's a chance on the evaluation, or there's space on the evaluations for you to let Bonnie know about that. About the presentations themselves, we've asked the panelists to give their thoughts on their traditions, the way in which their traditions speak about death and about how individuals might handle what comes in the afterlife. Each person is free to interpret this question as they wish and to define what they see as the most important facets of their tradition. That is, we've asked them not to particularly recite some kind of creed or rote understanding, but really to speak from their own understanding of their tradition. And secondly, each of the panelists speaks from their understanding of tradition, but not for the tradition. They are spokespeople, again, giving us a view of their tradition, but not speaking for all members of their tradition. Let me introduce the panelists. Janice Chittasuba Shepherd has practiced in the Thai Theravada Buddhist tradition since 1995. She was trained as a Buddhist lay minister by Ajahn Pasano and Ajahn Amaro of the Abhayagiri, I hope I got that right, Buddhist monastery. She is a longtime participant and board member of Madison Insight Meditation Group and has offered a weekly meditation evening for them since 2003. She also offers mindfulness and Buddhist services in Wisconsin prisons and retreats at several locations in the Midwest. Esti Dinur is an Israeli-American journalist, a non-observant Jew, and a shul butterfly. Maybe she can explain for those who don't know what that might be. She is a member of Jewish Voice for Peace Madison and a founder of the Madison branch of Veterans for Peace. You can hear her talk show on Fridays at noon on Ward 89.9 FM in Madison. And finally, we have Minister Pamela Soward, and there she is. Welcome, Minister. She is a psychotherapist at a Anusis Therapy Center in Madison and had a very late patient, which explains why she's coming to us from online rather than being here. She has a specialty in treating alcohol and drug dependencies and also offers hypnotherapy and Reiki therapy. She is a minister in the Mount Zion Baptist Church. And with those introductions, let me turn the session over to our panelists. Janice, if you would.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, thank you. You just and take it off. Yeah, and just hold it if you want to. I know my voice often doesn't carry very well. How is that if I hold it? Yeah, closer even. Okay, remind me if it slips. Okay. This is lovely to be sort of close to people. That's quite nice. Of course, beginning by thanking Rabbi Bonnie and Wisconsin Faith Voices and Mount Zion Church for offering this opportunity and for all of you for showing up. I understood the topic to be, what does my faith teach about death and dying? I am not planning and didn't go into afterlife and things like that. So hopefully that's all right. I was really happy to be offered this opportunity to speak about what my faith teaches me about death and dying. And it's a bit overwhelming because there's so much I'd like to share about this. And I have a brief time because death and dying really is what brought me to my Thai Theravada tradition. The teachings of the Buddha offered me a refuge when both of my siblings and my father were facing terminal illness and dying. And these teachings have continued to guide my life through every struggle and every joy. They give me a sense of confidence and ease I'd never imagined possible before I encountered her. These teachings offered me something that made sense of this crazy world and provided solace in ways I didn't see many others having. They provided a way for me to understand the reality of my own death and how to live until then. I came to the Buddhist teachings because of this illness that was surrounding me. Their truth was confirmed by seeing how much suffering around death was not due solely to the significant physical pain, but was due to the mental and emotional pain of not liking the truth of what it means to have a human body and live in a world as it is. Buddhism woke me up to the truth of change, impermanence, uncertainty, unreliability. It helped me understand that unreliability and change are not due to my personal failure or incompetence, or the failure and incompetence of others. It is the nature of the world that we were born into. If we seriously consider why everything changes, the only truthful answer is that that is how life is and how it always has been. The suffering is immense and unending if we refuse to acknowledge or recognize these truths. So Will Rinpoche says one of the chief reasons we have so much anguish and difficulty facing death is that we ignore the truth of impermanence. We so desperately want everything to continue as it is that we have a belief that things always will stay the same. But this is only make-believe. And as we so often discover, belief has little or nothing to do with reality. The Buddhist teachings asked me to reflect calmly and constantly. Death is real, and it comes without warning. As Buddhists, we're encouraged to reflect on death frequently and even daily, remembering that death is certain, only the time is uncertain. Before learning about this Buddhist attitude toward death, I saw only two options. One was to deny and fear death, to keep it far from consciousness, to consider thoughts of it as morbid, and to superstitiously think that the mention of it was like wishing it to occur. The other option was to adopt an ignorant cheerfulness, that somehow it will all work out okay, and it's nothing to worry about, it's just natural, isn't a big deal. I'll be fine. This is a nice theory, until we are actually dying or watching a loved one die. And neither considering death as something to hide from, nor ignorantly fooling ourselves that it will just take care of itself can help us when that very difficult reality hits. Instead, according to the wisdom of the Buddha, we can use our lives to prepare for death. We do not have to wait for the painful death of someone close to us or the shock of terminal illness to force us into looking at our own lives. We can begin here and now to understand how we increase suffering through our responses, choices, or rigid views, and how we can let go. The Buddhist teachings are for us to understand suffering, the causes of suffering, and that there is a pain. I was quite protected from death, as are many in our society, until I was in my late 30s. And then over a span of about 20 years, my entire nuclear family sickened, dealt with illness, and died. My father died of a prostate-related bowel blockage in 1986, my brother of AIDS in 1994, my sister first had breast cancer that went into remission, and then got ovarian cancer that killed her in 2003, and then my mother died of Alzheimer's in 2009. Their illnesses and subsequent deaths were my greatest teachers, and what led me to Buddhism and convinced me it was the path for me. My father and my sister's deaths really began my spiritual quest and caused me to determine I did not want to die like them. I did not want to die with the grief, the denial, the anger, the bitterness, and the abject fear that I saw in them. Watching them, I knew that that was not how I wanted my life to end, and that I needed another way. But I didn't know anything else was truly possible until I had the great gift and privilege to watch my brother die. My brother's illness also led him to search, and it led him to Buddhism, actually a different branch of Buddhism than I follow, but Buddhism. Seeing how he lived and died reaffirmed my commitment to a Buddhist path. My brother David was his name. Cyril converted to become HIV positive in 1986, as my father was dying. This was the very beginning of the AIDS epidemic, you may recall, and at this point, the diagnosis of AIDS was a death sentence. There were no treatments whatsoever. He did die of AIDS about 8.5 years later, but that during those years, he lived with amazing intention, kindness, and wisdom. Once he realized his mortality, he found Tibetan Buddhism, he searched it out, found it, changed his career to have less stress and more freedom, ate right, exercised, and visited and maintained ties to relatives, much more than any of the rest of us did. During those 8 years, he committed life to a life of kindness and compassion in ways he hadn't previously. He volunteered and delivered food to others who were housebound as they were dying from AIDS. He worked on forgiveness to heal the rift between himself and my father. And even once my father died, he continued to work on that process. And he was always a voice of compassion and forgiveness when I would complain about my sister or my mother. Looking back, I now know that our phone conversations were sort of little Dhamma talks from him on compassion, on equanimity, and on letting go. During his final 2 years, David took care of all the details of his death so that we wouldn't need to. He went through all of his possessions and gave everything away. He donated his valuable books to art museums and libraries and gave the rest away. He made lists of all the various professionals that should be contacted when he died and gave me and other family members information about his plans and his wishes. David seldom complained about his physical condition. He used alternative medicine primarily for about 6 of the 8 years. He hid most of the physical symptoms from us. He was not living near me. He was living in Washington, D.C., and I was here in Madison. My mother was in Illinois, my sister in Boston. He was sickest for the last 6 months of his life. He had chemo in the summer of 1995 and never really recovered very well. In October, he was hospitalized for a few days and he hated it. Then in early November, he was hospitalized again for 11 days with pneumonia. We were quite concerned during this hospitalization because he refused to take or return phone calls, which was completely out of character. He was always in contact. He had never isolated himself in that way before. Then he was released and was still quite sick. And on November 12th, 1995, I got a call at work from his partner, Tim. Tim said David had signed himself out of the hospital against the doctor's orders and was coming home. He had told Tim to call me, my mom, and my sister and tell us that now was the time we should come if we wanted to see him again. My mom and I flew out right away and stayed with Tim and David for the next 10 days as he died at home. That week was a gift. He spoke relatively little and was semi-conscious some of the time, but when he was awake, that is what I remember and what was the lesson that I carry to this day. When my mom and I arrived, David had returned home by ambulance just before, and the trip had been very hard. The ride was very rough for him because he was so thin and every bump was painful. He was emaciated. He hadn't been able to sit in an unupholstered chair for months and could only sit in a very, very soft chair for short periods because he was so very thin. Because he was mostly mouth breathing, His lips and the inside of his mouth were dried and caked and bloody. His skin was ashen, his eyes were sunken. Periodically, he'd give high-pitched yelps that I think were likely pain. He spoke relatively little that week, but what he said didn't require a lot of words. When we would enter his room, or whenever he would realize that we were around, he'd break into this enormous smile and say, "Bye-bye, I'm out of here." His smile was the happiest, biggest, most engaging smile you can imagine. You couldn't look at him and not smile too. I think maybe because he was so very thin that when he smiled, it like took his entire face. First, you'd look at him and just see the wreck of this body. But then he'd smile at you, and all you'd see was total happiness, kindness, warmth in this enormous smile. I never actually knew the meaning of sublime until I saw David's smile during that week. David was in great physical pain, but that was not his focus. David knew how to let go. And in letting go, he brought enormous happiness to himself and to us. He was wonderful to be with. It was a transformative experience to be with him at his death, a gift. It's hard to tell people that the best time of my life was at my brother's death. It was such a contrast to the deaths of my brother, of my father and my sister, where grief was just never ending, and fear and sorrow and anger and irritation. My brother's death was just one more change after 8 years and change. David faced the suffering of life and showed us the joy possible in letting go. And it certainly was not that David was in any less physical pain than my father or my sister. All three of them had intense physical pain for many months before their deaths. What was different was how he related to this experience, with the wisdom, the clarity, and the kindness that he had learned to rely on, that his practice had taught him. So that rather than going to fear and anxiety and anger, he went to generosity, to kindness, to clarity. Based on what the Buddha taught, my faith points to training the heart and mind to stay open, generous, wise, accepting, and equanimous. These teachings are not only for dealing with death. They allow me to live each day with greater clarity, more ease. They make life understandable rather than overwhelming, confusing, and horrifically sad. To urge us to understand the truth of the way things are, and the way things are is that human bodies age, sicken, and die. That we get what we don't want, and that we don't get what we do want. That we will lose what is beloved. In the face of all this, all we can control are our own actions of body, speech, and mind, and consider whether these actions lead to more suffering or to more kindness and compassion. So I'd like to end my comments here with just a very brief chant that really summarizes what I've been trying to say. It's called the 5 Subjects for Frequent Recollection. And it goes like this. I am of the nature to age. I have not gone beyond aging. I am of the nature to sicken. I have not gone beyond sickness. I am of the nature to die. I have not gone beyond dying. All that is mine beloved and pleasing, will become otherwise, will become separated from me. I am the owner of my action, heir to my action, born of my action, related to my action, abide supported by my action. Whatever actions I shall do, for good or for ill, of that I will be the heir. Thus we should frequently recollect. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Janice, for a very powerful presentation that I'm sure all of us are still vibrating. Esty, please.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So I was raised in Israel in what you might say was an ultra secular family, even anti-God. My father was raised religious, but he lost 5 of the 9 members of his family in the Holocaust, and with them he lost his faith, or maybe as I learned much later in his life, I'm not sure he lost his faith, but he didn't want anything to do with that. My mother was raised in a secular family and was never interested in religion or in Judaism. She was interested in life as we know it. And most of the people I knew were like us, so we did have some religious relatives that we visited from time to time and observed them as they were doing strange things to do with the religion. As I grew up and found that I have spiritual needs, I've studied Sufism for several years, studied Gnosis, dabbled in Buddhism. In 2000, I was invited to a sweat lodge and have been invited to various sweats and ceremonies since, and have found that very useful to do the Native American spiritual work. And then on my 5th Christmas here, I became Jewish, is the way I see it. I was so tired of the horrible music and the calls to consume and consume. And the whole thing, I'm sorry, those of you who are Christians, I found it very disturbing. And at one point I remember just saying to myself, I'm Jew. This is not my thing and I don't want it. And then I became Jewish. And then I started going to services in 2020 when my family was going through a crisis. And I found much solace in going to the high holidays and participating with community. And then through Facebook, I met an old friend from Israel, now also lived in the United States, and found out to my amazement that he had become a rabbi. And he was studying the esoteric side of Judaism, and I asked to study with him, and he invited me to do so. And so we studied for a bunch of years until his death. And so really my knowledge of Judaism is more of the esoteric side, though you cannot study that without studying Judaism per se. So I became more Jewish. I found many beautiful things in it, and have gone through several congregations. Shul means synagogue in Yiddish. And I said, I define myself as a shul butterfly because I've been through this and that and this and that. And one of them was perfect for my politics, but didn't satisfy my spiritual needs and other this and that. And surprisingly, I ended up actually finding my Jewish spiritual home at Chabad, which is the most conservative, politically exactly on the other end of my politics. But that was a good thing too, because I learned that I can love people who, you know, in some ways are the enemy, if you will, you know, and that they also knew exactly where I was standing, but were very welcoming and very loving. So I'm not going there now because political situation. But so that's what my shul butterfly part is. My mother died some 7.5 years ago. I wasn't expecting it. It came to me as a surprise. And when the call came, I immediately made arrangements to go to Israel for her Shiva. Shiva means 7 in Hebrew. You sit at your home or the home of the deceased for 7 days, and people come. And that's what I'm going to talk about. As I learned while preparing for this presentation, there are many religious rules on what to do and what not to do during that time. None of us, my brothers or I or my father, knew these rules, and we didn't follow them. But the reason I offered to talk about that experience is so as to share with you the deep effect that it had on me, and to recommend that others may be look into doing something similar. You don't have to be a Jew, I think, to follow this kind of lengthy ceremony, if you will, after someone that you love dies. So my brothers waited for me to arrive. So Shiva started actually 3 days after the death, rather than the next day. And it had a wonderful and profound experience. It was a wonderful and profound experience, and it allowed me to come to terms with my mother's sudden death and to start accepting that I no longer had her. So I will read from here, I will read to you from a piece I wrote after I came back and after some time has passed.
I know, it's just money. Did I tell you we got a place for Lori's parents here? Yes.
I will continue. I think someone is not on mute and we hear them. But okay, I will continue. So here goes. When I arrived at my parents' home, my brothers were there, along with some of their kids, my father, and a few early visitors. There was a beautiful spread on the dining table. The sun poured through the window and the conversation was easy. During the rest of the time, we had more than 100 guests come and go, some bringing food with them, some coming from far away, driving 5 to 6 hours each way. We are not a prominent family. We don't have much money. There was nothing in it for them. They came because we were sitting Shiva, and that's what you do. They were all friends and neighbors, people I haven't seen in 5 or 40 years, extended family, colleagues of my brothers, people I recognized and people I had never met. My parents' home is a condo, and we learned that all the young people in the building were friendly with my mother. We heard stories we'd never heard before and were reminded of other long-lost ones. We found out that we're the repositories of conflicting stories about family history. It didn't occur to me that I might find myself engaging in political arguments during my mother's Shiva. But it being Israel, where arguing is a national sport, they're known peacenik and supporter of Palestinian rights. There was at least one such debate or discussion each day. My mother, who was never interested in politics, would have approved. I started doing this at the age of 14 in this very house. My notion that peace is preferable to war was called naive by some and extremists by a person who voted for the Jewish Home Party, which is sharply to the right. When someone bid me goodbye leftist, another person who I never met before turned to me and extended an invitation to a meeting of politicians from the Palestinian Authority, right-wing Israelis, and Druze dignitaries as the hosts and moderators. I went for half a day. My mother would have expected me to do so. Back at the house, I had a weighty discussion with the retiree of the Israeli security services, seizing the opportunity to try and understand his way of thinking and appreciating his sincere interest in what I had to say. We had some 5 guests at the time who all listened quietly. There were people in the house almost constantly, but when we had a few minutes by ourselves, my clean-free brother cleaned, then the 3 of us siblings, or the 4 of us with my father, sat together. We read Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead, and Psalms. We discussed what to do about my father and found that all 4 of us agreed on next steps. I sat with him and we talked about my mother and her absence and his concerns for the future. We read my mother's will and made sure that everybody had a copy and that all agreed that the money went not to us, but to care for my father. In her will, my mother asked that, most importantly, do not argue or fight. We didn't, and we agreed that we wouldn't. I felt closer to my brother than I'd been at any time since our childhood. More people showed up. Some came more than once. A friend of my brother's who knew my mother well and loved her came for 4 days running, bringing his brother, who didn't know my mother, on one of these days. Some people wore black, but most of us didn't. A few were dressed fancy, most wore simple, everyday clothes. Friends of my nieces and nephews came and brought their parents or food that their parents made. Little kids scampered around, making noise, hiding under the table, running in the hallway. Our cousins, who were not really our cousins, reminisced about doing the same thing when we were that age. We sat, young and old, and anywhere in between, people who have known each other all their lives and had an opportunity to catch up, and those who had never met before and likely never will again, and we talked. Sometimes in big circles, sometimes breaking into small groups, sometimes with just 1 or 2 visitors. We were the embraced center of a human stream whose intent was to blunt our pain, to remind us how loved my mother was, to honor her, and to help us through those hard first few days. My father, who suffered from Alzheimer's, was clear almost the entire time. He sat and listened to the conversations and discussions and refused to go rest for fear he might miss an interesting story or debate. One of my brothers proved to be quite a storyteller, able to hold the attention of all in the circle when he recounted old family stories and histories. He told of my father's arrival in Palestine under the British mandate, 19 years old and responsible for half the people on an illegal ship full of Jewish refugees from post-World War II Europe. A man my brother had known well for many years cut into his story to say that his mother had arrived on that same ship. Like us, getting sure that like us, he had participated as a young child in the reunion of those former illegal aliens. I became real friends with my 2 nieces. My brother read the palms of the hands of all the youngsters, dishing out revelations and advice. I said, Eve, the name of my mother, would have loved this so much. What a shame she isn't here. And everyone agreed. I cried at night alone in my hotel room, but arrived again the next morning to more visitors, more stories, more good food. A childhood neighbor quoted her husband, who had said it is called Shiva because you gain 7 pounds. At one point, we took a break and went to get falafel like we did when we were kids. I brought the best hummus ever and a tray of mixed baklava or baklava, as you say, when I returned from the encounter in the Druze village. None of us listened to the radio, watched TV. We didn't know what was going on in Israel in the American election spectacle of that time or at our workplaces. We will sit in Shiva, fully. We intended to end the Shiva around noon on Friday. The nieces and nephews and their partners conspired to bring a big homemade lunch, and we planned to be together before we dispersed back to our lives. But surprise! More people showed up and more great conversations took place. We had lunch around 4 p.m. and a couple hours later, it was time to pack up and leave. It was heartbreaking to see my father, along with his caretaker, standing at the door. I left feeling concerned for him. But I am also profoundly grateful to have had this experience. I no longer understand how a funeral and a 3-hour celebration of life of a deceased can suffice. I wish a Shiva experience of any person who loses someone dear to them. You do end up going back into the world, returning to work, crying in your office or in your bed, learning to live with your loss. But you do it with a cushion of days spent with people whose entire goal during their visit was to prop you up, allow for some softness, support you in your dark times so it becomes lit up. You don't have to be Jewish to do this, but sadly at this juncture, it's not likely that the American work cult would allow for such a custom to become widespread. For now, if this speaks to you, you'd have to make it happen on your own. Take time off from your work and the rest of your daily life and let everyone you know and who knew the person who passed that you'll appreciate their participation and see what happens. Thank you.
I knew that we would be getting into deep waters. I'm not sure that I knew how profoundly personal the presentations would be. And I thank our panelists so far for taking the kinds of risks to open themselves in public. Our third presenter is Minister Pam Soward. For those of you online, there she is. The screen is behind the panel, so I'm going to have to crane my neck. Minister, the floor is yours. Thank you, and thank you for coming.
Good evening. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Well, the question is, what does your faith teach you about death and dying and the afterlife? And so and mine's not going to be that long. So, you know, I didn't really prepare for, you know, that type of a testimony. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
And I think that's fine.
Okay, because you know, that, you know, the way that the ladies presented theirs was similar to the history of Mount Zion. And I've been a part of Mount Zion for all of my life. And my grandfather helped to build a sanctuary that you're sitting in, this part that's going to be torn down eventually, where we're planning on building a family life center. And so just to give you a little history of where you're sitting at right now. So, you know, we're hoping to raise enough money. It's going to be quite a bit. It's, you know, it's going to be 16 million in order to build. So if you all feel in your heart you want to contribute, that would be a great thing. It's, you know, if you don't ask, you don't get. So just, you know, just putting it out there. But to answer the question, to me, it starts with the baptism. So baptism is the death, burial, and resurrection. And so when we accept Jesus as Lord and Savior of our life, we are the baptism part is how we were crucified with him. And then the immersion in the water is our burial, representative of the burial. And then us coming up out of the water is representative of the resurrection. And so from that point, we believe that you have a new life once you have been baptized. So you have a new life, but then once you come up, that new life that you're in, is you're resurrected again. So the old life of sin and everything contrary to God is now a new life. You made a choice to live a new life. And so now you've resurrected into the new life, living for Christ in this flesh that you're in. And then the afterlife is that we have the privilege of going to live with God for eternity. So that's really summing it up in a nutshell. So the death, the dying, and the afterlife are similar to baptism, which is the death, burial, and resurrection. And so we're raised to a new life, and then but we die to sin, and our flesh is not perfect, so we still, are tempted. But because we have accepted by faith, that God is through His Holy Spirit is going to take care of us and lead us and guide us in the way that He would have us to go, then we are walking in the newness of life. So it's pretty simple. So is there any questions?
I think since this part of the program is run a little long, but following Minister Soward's remarks, let's have, if there are any questions, I'll make that very short. I want to make sure that we have sufficient time to talk among ourselves, because I think we need it. I certainly do. But are there any questions? Is that any?
Just briefly, what are the Jewish beliefs on the afterlife and the Buddhist beliefs on the afterlife?
So I'm not sure that I'm the right person to answer it, but I can tell you what I learned when I studied with my friend, the rabbi. Oh, sorry, yeah. So I said that I'm not sure that I'm really the right person to answer it, since I don't know that much, but here's what I heard from the rabbi that I studied with. As he explained it, there's we get to a place where there are, if I remember correctly, 452 rooms, so to speak. It's not, none of it is literal, right? And we have to go through these stages. Our soul has to go through the stages so that it can be cleansed, not cleansed, so we can cleanse ourselves, right? It's not somebody is doing it for us. But where we are cleansed and look at, I suppose, the mistakes and also the things that we did right and learn from that. And eventually we come out, and we are ready at that point to be resurrected, if you will, to come back to a flesh phase of that life, right? And yeah, it's interesting. Okay, so maybe maybe I'm going here way out of the scope of what we're talking about, but I've been also doing a lot of ancestral work. You know, like I said, my father is a Holocaust survivor. More than half of his family died in Auschwitz, and you know, there's generations and generations of trauma before that. And it took some time, it took several years after my rabbi friend died before he showed up in that work. So, you know, it may be just me and how I think, and, you know, I may be just strange, but if I'm not, if these things are real, it took him some time to show up. So, I guess that's really all I can tell you, because that's what I know. I'm sure that if a rabbi were here, they could talk about it for an hour or 15 hours.
So, you know, Buddhism has a complex cosmology, as most traditions do. And the Buddha did speak about rebirth. However, I would say the focus of Buddhist tradition is on, the Buddha was incredibly practical. He was interested in understanding suffering and ending suffering in this very life. So while there is lots to say about the rebirth is a part of what the Buddha taught, because until suffering ends, the habit energy just keeps being reborn. And when suffering ends, that habit energy is no longer reborn. But none of us can really know that, or not none of us, most of us cannot know that. And so the focus, I would say, in Buddhism is much more practical on how do I live in this very life to reduce my own suffering and the suffering of others.
Thank you. Minister, is there anything that you would like to add or comment on before we break out into our groups?
Do you want to?
Yeah, here I was on mute. So just to give a little history of Mount Zion, the sanctuary that you're in now was built by, once again, my grandfather, but it was built during Jim Crow, and how the Black church was struggling back then just to, you know, even be able to get pieces of wood. They had to go to construction sites and be able to buy the wood that was left over. And so knowing the history of the Black church is so important, and the history of Black people in Madison. When you talk about suffering, you know, the suffering of Jim Crow, and, you know, from slavery even to, you know, present day, and the new Jim Crow, of course, the incarceration rate and the infant and maternal mortality rate. So that's what the Black church is working on. And so that is part of our history. And so our history is struggle as well. And so just understanding that all faiths need to unite together so that we can work together for the injustices that are going on in our country, and that we must work together and get on one accord in order for us to be able to move forward, because we can't do this by ourselves. You know, we have to work together in order to be able to move forward and to get things done.
Let me ask you, Mr. one quick question, if I may. Can you enlighten the rest of us as to what Joy's Christian particularly from your church, your tradition, expect through the resurrection?
What joys?
Yes, and maybe I'm labeling it too much, but from my understanding outside, Christians may be able to look forward to death because they will be resurrected at a later time. Could you say something more about that from your perspective?
Well, if you do it comparatively to slavery, and how the deliverance, we'll use, like, I know the Voting Rights Act is not really fully there yet, but Juneteenth, let's use Juneteenth as an example. So Juneteenth happened in 1865, but the actual date for emancipation was actually 1863. So there was 2 years where slaves were given, they had to do free labor because they were not told that the Emancipation Proclamation had been finalized. And so when you're talking about joy, it's every little thing that Black folks have went through and been able to overcome. You can't name just one thing. And we're still struggling today, trying to get equality. And a lot of, we're in an all-white audience tonight. I'm the only Black person that's, in this room or in this discussion. And so thinking in terms of that, unless I'm missing somebody back there, I don't know. But as far as I can see, it's mostly all white folks. And so, when you're talking about the joy is not retaliating against white folks for all the atrocities and terrorism that we have experienced, because you don't have Black people forming Ku Klux Klan to go and kill white folks. And so the joy is knowing that we can move forward with a clear conscience and not have to worry about any repercussions later on. And that's not to say that, we didn't fight back some type of way, but our joy is in the salvation, and it's not over yet. We're still here. So there's more that God has in store for us. So, the joy is just knowing that God is in control and love is in control, and that we can move forward in that, even at the expense of all the things that's going on now. We can have that joy, that peace that passes all understanding, of knowing that God is in control. So I'm only speaking for myself. So, that's the joy that I feel, that knowing that God is in control and that he has the last say so.
Person or representative, just to give us a little sense of what you're talking about, we'd really like to hear from you. Can you share anything?
All right.
I was with Dennis and we had a good conversation. And Dennis is a Baptist and I'm a Baha'i, and we shared some information about how Baha'is don't fear death because we're told death is a messenger of joy if you're prepared for it. This time is a time to gather virtues, to learn virtues, have virtuous behavior, and then you'll be okay in the next world, because it's an evolutionary journey. So don't fear it, but get ready.
Right.
Well, okay. And anyone else from online care to share an insight, a thought, a feeling or a reaction to what you've been hearing?
Well, I mean, I'll say a little something for our group. It was Mary and Carolyn, and we just talked about the traditions of, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I just talked about the tradition of the Black church of, we call the ceremony a homegoing. Mary talked about the Catholic faith, and it was similar to the Baptist faith. The only difference was, I think the Jewish faith doesn't talk about the doesn't say anything to the family. They just leave them to grieve, and so they only talk when they're ready. Is that correct, Mary? You're on mute.
On mute.
Okay.
I wouldn't say leave them to grieve, but we sort of take the lead, let them take the lead, and
Okay.
not sort of impose a conversation on them before they're ready, but be there to listen.
But that was the Jewish tradition, though, correct?
Right.
Okay.
Correct.
And then Carolyn talked about caregiving, and what it was like to, you want to elaborate on that as well, Carolyn?
Well, I guess when you don't have a tradition to organize the ceremony for you, you're just too exhausted after all the caregiving is done to think through how you want to process anything other than the practical survival things that you were doing it with it as a caregiver.
A lot about Jews gathering in Shiva. Do you want to say anything else or have a reply?
Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly what was said, but what I heard is that Jews don't talk to the family and allow the family to say when they're ready, and that's totally not my experience. Like I discussed the tradition is you sit at your home or at the home of the deceased, and people start coming, and they come, they bring food, they bring stories, and they're there to help you go through these first 7 days of after death of someone dear to you. So I don't know, I guess it's possible that there's several different Jewish traditions, but I don't know any other than the Shiva.
Right. Thank you. Let's hear from some of the groups on the floor. Anyone like to volunteer?
Sure. From group one, how do we do that? From group one, we talked about preparation. We talked about preparation and being very open to thoughts of death. Some folks shared some family stories about those who avoided talk of death rather than confront it or rather than accept it, and that was sort of some of the things that we shared.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for sharing all these amazing views. I happen to be in a non-diverse group of all Baha'is, because they asked me to represent the Baha'i views of death. So first death starts, the idea of life starts in the womb. And when the baby is in the womb, they're developing their hands and their organs and their legs and their feet, and they don't know why. We didn't know why we were developing our body parts when we were in the womb. So when we got into this world, hey, we started to use them. So then the next step was being in this world where we're developing virtues. And our place in the next world depends on the grace of God and the virtue that we have developed in our life here. So that goes beyond, developing virtues does go beyond, race, religion, sexual identity. You're developing those virtues, and that's what makes you, that determines your station in the next world. And so that's the goal of our life here, which is what we're thinking about. Hopefully we're not thinking about our placement, we're thinking about developing virtue. And of course, the grace of God is important for where you are placed in the next world as well. And that's the worlds of worlds. That's forever over there. So this is just a short journey here where you're tested, and yes, you do suffer, and you're tested to determine where you are forever. So that is one part. And we believe this is true of people of every religion, not just Baha'i. So we believe that this stage of development is for all of us, everyone in this room, everyone in the world. It's not just Baha'i. We don't believe in hell or heaven. We believe the more you develop these virtues, the closer to God, the closer to Baha'u'llah, the closer to Jesus, the closer to Allah, or whoever your manifestation is, and God and stuff, or herself, whatever you want to believe about that. But this is true for everyone. And prayer is really important for your station in the next world. So we pray for people in the next world, and that helps them while they pray for us. So that's part of this interchange between the next world and here. And Baha'u'llah has said, I have made death a messenger of joy to thee, wherefore thou trust free, as Patty had said. So it is a messenger of joy, as we have been talking about on the panel. And so this is the Baha'i view, is from the womb to developing virtues to the next world, and the interchange of all of us. And the fact that we're all in this together, the same system and process for everyone.
Thank you very much.
Suffering at the time of death, just the feeling of peace. And afterwards, there is no rigor mortis or signs of decay in the body, the bad smell. The things that we do embalming to avoid, they don't embalm in Japan anyway, they use dry ice. But without the dry ice, just case after case after case, where the cheeks are rosy and the body is warm, and this is like 3 days later, 4 days later, and it's been very well documented over there with film and research and by the version of the AMA in Japan, and happened with people that I know. And the founder of the faith said the reason this miracle will happen is simply to prove that there is life after death, that the spirit goes on, and to show that the body will end, but it will end gracefully, and the spirit is continuing. So the whole thing of the faith is about miracles, and one of the 4 miracles is what happens at the time of death.
Interest in Buddhism, I think we all noticed that none of us currently hold the same religious beliefs as we did when we were raised. So that was a common experience. A few of us have experienced deaths of close people in the last year or even in the last few weeks, which probably in part explains why we're even all here. You know, it's something that we've been thinking about this a lot. There are different views of the afterlife. Well, people have already talked about the Baha'i faith. In my own experience in Reformed Judaism, it just wasn't that important. It's not, I mean, it was kind of something that was there, but it wasn't as important as it is, I think, to Christians and people in the Baha'i faith. And Bonnie could probably speak to this, the different versions, but you know, there's one site I just looked up. There are many different views that Jews have of the afterlife, to, you know, to it exists, to the idea that you live on in the people who continue to have a corporal presence, you know, and I think our group is all over the place on that.
All over the place does sound like Jews. Thank you all. We've reached the end of our session. A few last points. Please, if you have done the evaluations, you can put them on the table here.